In the year 78 AD, Roman forces led by Governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola invaded the island of Anglesey in northern Wales. Over the past 2 decades, the island had proven a major centre for British resistance to the wider Roman conquest, and the reception to this latest invasion proved to be mixed. After successfully mopping up this resistance and pacifying the southern half of Britain for about 5 minutes, Agricola decided that he wasn't done there. From the year 80 onwards, he and his forces invaded the lands of the Caledonians in what is now Scotland no less than 5 times. Whilst this went well for a while and helped add to the growing collection of Roman forts in the area, the Caledonians eventually decided, yeah, no. After several years of warfare, Agricola packed his bags and returned home, and within a few more years, Rome's presence in the area was largely over. This didn't stop the Romans from trying again, though. For the next century, they would make several more attempts to conquer Scotland, and in doing so, grab a slice of its innovative deep-fried pizza industry. In the mid-2nd century, they made it as far north as the Firth of Forth, where they built the massive Antonine Wall and succeeded in pacifying the Scottish lowlands for about 5 minutes. Eventually though, the Romans gave up on their dreams of securing a reliable supply of iron brew, and after a couple of decades, they retreated behind Hadrian's Wall to lick their wounds.
Imagine then that you're Agricola around this time. You've pacified Britain at the cost of paying for a massive garrison, and with the Caledonians stubbornly continuing to vote for Brexit, there doesn't look to be much chance of integrating them into the Roman Empire anytime soon. Where else then might you look for an easy conquest? Oh, I don't know, perhaps the one remaining part of Western Europe that the Romans hadn't already tried to conquer? After all, it's not like Ireland, or Hibernia as it was often called then, was unknown to the Romans at this point. Reports of it had come down to them by the way of Greek geographers for centuries before they ever set foot in neighbouring Britain. After the conquest of Anglesey, not only would they have regularly encountered traders from across the Irish Sea, but on a good day, they'd even have been able to see the place. It's from Agricola's memories of his time here in Wales that we get some of the few descriptions of the ancient Irish that might actually be accurate. You know, the ones that don't describe them all as cannibals, incest fans, or talk about how their cows keep exploding. Yes, that last one is real. These recollections are found in the work of the ancient author Tacitus, who conveniently for us married Agricola's daughter and wrote a biography of his father-in-law. Quote, "In size it surpasses the islands of our sea, but it is narrower than Britain. As for the soil, climate and the character and lifestyle of its people, it differs little from Britain. The approaches and harbours are better known due to trade and merchants." From these recollections, though, it's clear that Agricola had something else on his mind when it came to Ireland.
I often heard him say that Hibernia could be conquered and occupied by one legion and a moderate number of auxiliaries. Moreover, it would be useful against Britain as well if Roman arms were everywhere raised high, and liberty, so to speak, vanished from sight.
And there we have it, the wistful recollections of a man thinking about the time he passed up an opportunity to brutally destroy the liberty of a group of people who'd done little to nothing against Rome. As ruthless as this sounds, though, the idea of taking Ireland did make a certain amount of strategic sense. Yes, it would have been expensive to do, but removing Ireland as a base for disgruntled British exiles would have been in Rome's interests. If you go by Irish mythology, deposed Irish kings themselves had a habit of fleeing to Britain when they came out the loser in local political struggles, and it wouldn't be surprising for the reverse to have also occurred during the Roman period. Tacitus even informs us of an example of such a prince who Agricola hosted at his court. Although, I wouldn't say that his motives were altruistic. Quote, "Agricola had welcomed a Hibernian prince who had been driven from home by rebellion. Nominally a friend, he might be used as a pawn in the game." Sadly for Agricola, and fortunately for the Irish, he never got to have a go at conquering Ireland. Probably. We'll get into it later. Ireland did keep popping up occasionally, though, in the writings of classical authors for the remainder of the time that the Romans were doing at Britain. Around the same time that Tacitus was busy burnishing his new dad's credentials, a comic poet named Juvenal was doing the exact opposite for pretty much everyone else in Roman society. For the better part of 30 years, this absolute menace wrote a series of poems mostly insulting Rome's upper crust, which made him so popular that at one point they might have thrown him out entirely. In the middle of all this raw, unbridled satire, though, he mentions a list of places that Rome conquered in Western Europe. Quote, To what a state of degradation we are come. Indeed, we have advanced arms beyond the shores of Ireland, and the recently captured Orkneys, and the mighty Britons with their short knights. But the deeds we perform in our victorious city will never be done by the men we have conquered. Hang on a second. The Romans conquered Britain, Orkney, and Ireland? This brief reference in an admittedly satirical text from a man whose name sounds a bit like the word juvenile might not seem like the most trustworthy of sources to think that the Romans ever conquered Ireland. Yet the combination of this reference with the quotes from Tacitus, some of the texts of Irish mythology, and a major archaeological find in the last few decades has led a small number of archaeologists to argue that Rome may well have attempted to do a Roman Ireland. At the very least, it opens up the question of what types of cultural interactions these two groups of peoples would have had in their centuries of being neighbours, and any hypothetical invasion provides us with a lens through which to examine that relationship. And as I live within easy travel distance of all the major sites involved and fancied an excuse for a holiday, I thought, why not make a video on the topic?
So join me on a globe-trotting journey to establish the truth of whether Rome ever invaded Ireland. We'll explore such exotic locations as this bit of Britain, along with some other places that are also right next to Britain. For everywhere else, well, I guess there's always some stock footage I can stand in front of unconvincingly.
Let's get started.
To get something clear right off the bat, no, there isn't any evidence that the Romans ever conquered Ireland. There is a decent amount of Roman material in the Irish archaeological record from this period, more on that later, but there's simply nothing near the level of physical evidence you would expect if Rome had taken over and administered the entire country for any significant length of time. The question we're going to examine today then is, did the Romans ever seriously attempt an invasion of Ireland, or at the bare minimum make plans for one? When I first began researching this topic, I expected that it might be something of a fringe theory, and that the majority of archaeologists and scholars on the period would either have dismissed the idea out of hand or remained silent on the matter. To my surprise though, I was completely wrong. The theory of a Roman invasion of Ireland has actually been kicking around since at least the mid-19th century, and since the 90s, a number of notable archaeologists and scholars have weighed in on both sides of the argument.
On the pro-invasion side, one of the earliest to sound the charge was Dr. Richard B. Warner, former keeper of antiquities at Ulster Museum, who since the mid-1970s has argued that stronger contacts took place between the Romans and the Irish than can be explained by incidental trading and cultural exchanges. In a controversial 1995 article, he would argue that Agricola did indeed invade Ireland, though unsuccessfully. The possibility of a Roman presence in Ireland was also given serious scrutiny by Professor Barry Raftery in the 90s in his work Pagan Celtic Ireland, and in the last 2 decades, figures such as Professors John Waddell and J.P. Mallory, along with Dr. Jacqueline Carhill-Wilson, have weighed in on the literary and archaeological evidence that has been presented to further this argument. Elsewhere, the amateur scholar Vittorio Di Martino also wrote an extensive 2006 work on the topic, fittingly titled Roman Ireland, in which he similarly argued that such an invasion was carried out and probably landed somewhere either near Belfast or in the Dublin region. Outside of Warner and Di Martino, though, most experts have remained non-committal about the possibility of an invasion. Instead, many of them consider it as just one possibility for explaining some of the archaeological finds that we'll be talking about later. Usually they discuss it alongside more mundane explanations, such as trading and small non-Irish groups taking up residence on the Isle. All of which are elements of the story that we're going to examine today.
In terms of literary evidence for such an invasion, the sources most often cited by its advocates are the previously mentioned quotes from Tacitus and Juvenal. In addition to Tacitus's quotes where Agricola claimed that conquering Ireland would be easy peasy, particular interest has been placed on the claim that the Roman general entertained an exiled Irish ruler amongst his retinue until such time as he could exploit him. Keeping such a figure in hand certainly sounds plausible, and would be in line with the wider practices of Roman diplomacy. If you're at all familiar with Roman history, you'll be aware that Rome often administered its more troublesome border regions through systems of client kings and vassals. They were also big fans of spamming a simple formula to give their conquest the veneer of legitimacy. First, find a local ruler who could be convinced to support your objectives and grant him favourable trade deals and protection from Rome in return for a healthy tribute and acknowledgement of your overlordship. Second, wait in the hope that he gets kicked out, possibly for being too pro-Roman. Then third, invade under the pretext of putting him back on his throne, and profit. This sort of strategy had worked great in Britain, and in the century prior to their invasion, a number of kingdoms in what is now southern England had increasingly been reduced to Romanized tributaries as a result of their extensive trade and cultural exchanges with neighbouring Roman Gaul. Indeed, one theory is that much of their initial conquest of southern Britain may have been conducted under the pretext of restoring the pro-Roman claimant Verica to the throne of the Attribates in the area around modern Silchester.
David Warner, however, goes beyond Tacitus's text to suggest that this nameless Irish ruler actually did have a go at invading Ireland, either alongside Agricola or with his permission and military backing. In his 1995 article, he attempted to support this interpretation by drawing a link between Agricola's comments and a potential parallel figure from Irish mythology, whose exploits, he argues, may document such an invasion. This is the figure of Tuathail Tecmar.
Whilst few to no scholars argue that the events of Irish mythology represent actual history, Warner argues that the tale of this figure may represent a faded memory of a Roman-backed ruler landing in Ireland. For anyone unfamiliar, the story of Tuathail Tecmar is chronicled by a group of texts that date from across nearly a millennium, with the earliest being written in the 9th century and the last being written in the 17th century. A rough summary of the events of his life can be found in one of the most venerable texts of Irish mythology, the Leibhor Gavala Éireann, the earliest versions of which were likely composed somewhere in the 11th century. Here Tuathail is identified as the son of the High King Fiarhu Finnelach, who was slain as a result of an uprising and his throne usurped by King Elim. Luckily, Tuathail's pregnant mother, Enya, daughter of the King of Alba in modern Scotland, was able to escape to neighbouring Britain, where she gave birth to Tuathail and raised him. 20 years later, Tuathail, and possibly also his mother, returned to Ireland, where he was joined by a force of some 800 Irish warriors. Proceeding to the major centre of the Hill of Tara, he defeated Elim, and after a series of battles against Ireland's regional forces, he was eventually recognised as the High King of Ireland.
In addition to the obvious parallels between this figure and Tacitus's proposed Irish ruler, Warner also points to the various dates assigned to his reign by later chroniclers to back up his argument. Specifically, he points to the dates for Tuathail's reign in the 17th century Annals of the Four Masters of Ireland. This document was composed in an attempt to provide a summary of the entirety of Irish history up until that point, but drew upon many earlier Irish chronicles for their content dating back to the beginning of the 8th century. In a boost for this theory, the resulting document gives the year 76 as the date for Tuathail Tecmar's return, which puts him right within a few years of the dates of Agricola's various campaigns in Britain. Unsurprisingly, Warner's claims are proven highly controversial. According to Vittorio Di Martino, in January 1996, they would go the equivalent of pre-internet viral amongst archaeologists when the Sunday Times published an article claiming that a Roman hill fort had been unearthed on the coastal site of Drumanagh, about 15 miles north of Dublin. The article went on to describe the site as proof that Rome had indeed invaded Ireland, loudly trumpeting that, quote, "It indicates that the country was, after all, invaded by the Romans. The discovery has delighted archaeologists in Britain and Ireland, and ends the established belief that Ireland remained free of Roman influence." Barry Raftery would herald the find as the most important in Ireland in his field of study, whilst David Warner allegedly declared that, quote, "The excavation of the Drumanagh site will be the most significant excavation ever envisioned for any period of Irish history." Others, however, were quick to dispute the idea that this find represented a Roman fort. A day after the article was released, Emeritus Professor Michael Herity, formerly of University College London, spoke out against its conclusions, arguing that the artefacts discovered there were actually trade items acquired by the Iron Age Irish from Roman merchants. Quote, "The story has been fantasized and blown up into something it's not." These tensions were not helped by J. Maas, one of the co-authors of the original article, then deciding to chime in to say that, quote, "Long-held ideas die hard and painfully, and it would indeed be a pity if in the fallout of academic rivalry and backstabbing, the huge importance of Drumanagh becomes merely a sideshow." I'll spare you the rest of the argument that ensued to say that Raftery and Warner both scaled back their claims somewhat in an attempt to cool the debate down. Raftery now noted that the original article was the work of newspaper writers, less subject to the constraints of proof and logic than academics, whilst Warner elaborated that his invasion theory did not imply that Rome had actually conquered Ireland. Instead, he argued that this site may be proof that Agricola attempted to invade, but failed, and anyway, one site isn't enough to decide the issue. He also made a valuable point that we will revisit later, that the use of the term Roman simply implied an invasion or raid by a group of people from within the borders of the Roman Empire, not just Latin-speaking Italians. Unfortunately though, the damage had kind of already been done. As noted by Dr. Jacqueline Cahill-Wilson, all this press led to something of a chilling effect on the study of Drumanach's material, and it would take a substantial amount of time before archaeologists began to re-engage with the site.
We'll be coming back to Drumanagh in more detail later in the video. For the moment though, let's stay focused on Tuatha. Some 30 years after this article was published, most of the authors I consulted in my research for this video remained non-committal about any connections between Tacitus's work and Tuatha's claimed invasion. As we've discussed in a couple of different videos on this channel, Irish mythology is now thought to be an extremely dubious source of history prior to the early medieval period, a fact freely admitted by Warner in his article. Tuatha belongs to a period of time not long removed from likely mythical figures such as Cú Chulainn and Queen Maeve, and no contemporary evidence exists that names him in any source outside of the Irish mythological texts. The earliest of these still dates from many hundreds of years after the time that he was supposedly active in Britain and Ireland, and we have no idea if these accounts contain even a core of an actual historical event.
As for the overlap with the dates produced by the Four Masts of Ireland some 1700 years after his supposed existence, the coincidence is striking, but given the unreliability of Irish mythology, then a coincidence might be all it is. If we're going to take these dates literally, then there are also some details within the sources that they likely use to compile their records that make me a little dubious of their dates.
For example, a surviving recension of the Leibhor Gavala Éireann instead places reign as High King in the time of the Emperor Hadrian, which would put him some 40 to 60 years after the time of any invasion by Agricola. Other medieval texts also give different dates for his return and reign. The earliest of these, a 9th century poem by Moll Mura of Offain, also dates Tuatha to the early 2nd century, placing his existence some 750 years before the poem's likely composition date in the year 885. On top of all this, a major problem is that at no point in any of these texts are the Romans, or even any specific non-Irish figures outside of Tuatha's mother, mentioned as being connected to these events, despite some of their authors clearly being aware of the Romans' existence in the relevant passages.
So in my opinion then, yes it is possible that at its core, Tuatha's story contains a memory of a real event, where a deposed Irish ruler returned to the country to take up his throne again. With the current state of the evidence though, it seems equally possible that it doesn't, and that rather than referring to any specific event, this tale could simply be reflective of a wider pattern throughout medieval and Iron Age Irish history, of rulers fleeing to neighbouring lands only to later use them as a base for their return. And even if this is a record of an actual event, there's also no textual evidence to link it to Agricola in specific, or the Romans in general. There's also another claim piece of evidence in relation to Tuatha and a potential Roman invasion of Ireland that we will return to later. To keep with our literary sources though, there is also another passage from Tacitus that has been taken by some as evidence that some form of invasion was attempted by Agricola. Quote, "In the 5th year of the war, Agricola, crossing in the lead ship, conquered tribes unknown until that time, in frequent and successful engagements. The part of Britain that faces Hibernia he garrisoned with troops, more out of hope than out of fear."
As early as the 19th century, scholars have argued that this passage was evidence of an actual invasion of Ireland. In 1897, Professor Alfred Goodman of the University of Pennsylvania suggested in his Notes on the Agricola of Tacitus that the only way this passage made sense was if it referred to such an invasion. In Goodman's case though, his argument was quickly shouted down by his contemporaries, and that's where the matter seems to have ended. In 1928, the venerable Irish archaeologist R.A.S. McAllister would similarly argue in his book, The Archaeology of Ireland, that some form of invasion seemed to be required to explain Tacitus's reference and that of Juvenal, though as we'll discuss, he was generally dismissive of the idea that the Romans had any impact on Ireland at all. From the 1970s onwards, however, this passage was again being mentioned as potential evidence for an invasion, And in the next few decades, the possibility would be discussed both by Barry Raftery and J.F. Killen in their respective works. David Warner would simply mention it as part of his 1995 article, whilst DiMartino argued that it constituted evidence that Agricola did indeed perform the invasion of Ireland he argued for elsewhere in Tacitus's text.
This could be true, I think, if you squint a little. To me, though, this line reads a lot more ambiguously than either Warner or DiMartino claim. Nowhere does it directly mention where Agricola and his men landed, and as this would have constituted the first known time that a Roman army set foot in Ireland, then it's reasonable to think that Tacitus would have been more specific about reporting it as such.
Whilst DiMartino argues that this statement is clearly part of Tacitus's section on Ireland, it actually appears immediately before this section, and to me it seems to serve as a lead-in into his discussion of the country's peoples, rather than as a part of it. There are also other theories as to where this campaign could have been directed. For example, Dr. Philip Freeman of Pepperdine University, California, has claimed in his work Ireland and the Classical World that Agricola may instead have sailed across the Solway Firth into the lands of the Novantae in what is now Galloway in southern Scotland.
DiMartino would go on to make what I think is a pretty fair argument against this. Specifically, he claimed that the use of the phrase unknown in this passage means that it more likely refers to tribes based in Ireland, as the Caledonian tribes in the area of the Firth of Forth would already have been known to Agricola. This is a decent point, but it seems to me to be undone by the second line in this quote, that Agricola then garrisoned the whole part of Britain that faces Hibernia.
As the lands of the Novantae do face the northern parts of Ireland, this would lend more credence to his second claim than any invasion of Ireland. It should also be noted that none of Agricola's previous campaigns in northern Britain had been to the lands of the Novantae, nor do we know of any prior Roman campaigning in this area. As a result, it is possible that they may still have been relatively unknown to him and his forces at this point.
About the most that we can firmly say then is that Agricola certainly seems to have been doing everything he could to prepare for a potential invasion of Ireland. Whether or not anything ever actually came of it, the simple fact remains, though, that this source again leaves us with no unambiguous evidence in favour of an invasion, and without Tacitus directly mentioning Ireland, it's equally possible that the reason he didn't mention any invasion is because there wasn't one.
Moving on from Tacitus, the only remaining quote we have then from this time is that brief reference to Rome having advanced its arms beyond the shores of Ireland, found in Juvenal's works. On the surface, it would seem easy to dismiss this mention as simply a comic exaggeration, given the satirical nature of the poem. Despite this, some authors have explored or even defended the idea that this passage supports a Roman invasion of Ireland. Whilst Tacitus's work has received more scrutiny than Juvenal's, it was actually cited as evidence for a Roman invasion much earlier. As far back as 1866, Thomas Wright would argue in his Archaeology Cambrensis that Juvenal's reference to Ireland in his Satire No. 2 was not purely rhetorical. In addition to R.A.S. McAllister presenting it as part of his evidence for at least a limited invasion, Warner also briefly mentioned it as part of his 1995 article, and DiMartino would make an extensive defense of Juvenal's claim in his own work. Here he argued that whilst his works were intended to either be satirical or rhetorical, they rarely indulged in hyperbole when it came to referencing historical events. As an extra piece of evidence, he also points to Juvenal's claim in the same passage of the Romans having invaded the Orcades or Orkney Isles, which he describes as being historically true. Elsewhere, DiMartino also argues that this particular satire could have been written within 10 years of Agricola's death, so memory of such an invasion would still have been fresh.
Others, however, have pushed back against some aspects of these arguments. In Ireland and the Classical World, Dr. Philip Freeman argues that Juvenal does occasionally make hyperbolic statements regarding geography, such as at the beginning of the very same satire we've been discussing. Quote, "I long to escape from hence beyond the Sarmatians, and the frozen sea, whenever those fellows who pretend to be curiae and live like bacchanals presume to read a lecture on morality." To translate a little for those who don't speak 2nd century Romanese, here Juvenal was wishing to flee to the ends of the earth beyond the frozen seas, rather than to put up with hypocrites who presume to lecture on morality. It seems to me that the latter statement regarding Ireland could potentially be read in a similar exaggerated light, where Juvenal was despairing that despite Roman armies having metaphorically reached beyond the ends of the earth, none of the supposedly barbaric peoples of these lands would presume to commit the atrocities performed by his countrymen. When it comes to the point regarding Orkney, however, Di Martino does have a case, and a small number of written sources from the time do mention Roman affairs in Orkney. Our best source for this is, you guessed it, Tacitus's Agricola again. In it he claims that during Agricola's campaigns in Britain, he sent a fleet to circumnavigate the island, which did reach the Orkneys. Quote, "The coast of this remotest sea was at that time first rounded by a Roman fleet, thus proving that Britannia was an island. It also discovered and subdued hitherto unknown islands called the Orcades."
A 4th century author named Eutropius also mentions a king of Orkney as being amongst the British leaders that submitted to Claudius upon the Romans' initial invasion in the year 43, whilst the 5th century calendar written by Polemius Silvius mentions a Roman province named the Orcades, the same term used by Tacitus and Juvenal for the Orkneys. For a time, both of these later claims were considered dubious by scholars. In the last couple of decades, though, a number of archaeological finds have also been discovered on Orkney that likely indicate some form of Roman presence. The most notable of these have been found at the site of Mine Howe, where roughly 220 Romano-British artefacts have been found in the remains of an unusual circular enclosure and possible workshop. These, combined with the textual references, do seem to indicate that the Romans had some sort of presence on the islands, although whether this was the result of a long-term occupation or more of a trading relationship still seems to be uncertain.
Outside of this, there have also been occasional claims based on later sources that Juvenal may well have had first-hand experience of Britain, either from his possible time in exile or during a hypothetical period of military service there. If true, then this would add more weight to his claim, given that he may have heard near-contemporary accounts of this hypothetical invasion happening. Whether either of these events occurred, though, has been widely debated, and figures such as classic scholar Peter Green have argued that military service is incompatible with the anti-militarism tone of the satires. The result of all this is that whilst I am somewhat on Freeman's side when he claims that the reader should be dubious of Juvenal's claims, I think the surrounding context prevents us from dismissing his writings entirely. The simple fact, though, is that Juvenal's reference is so incredibly brief that it provides us with little useful information regarding a hypothetical invasion of Ireland, other than that such an event might have occurred. At the end of our examination of his work, then, we are in a similar situation to that we found ourselves in at the end of our examination of Tacitus's writings. Whilst both authors provide us with some tantalising details, the simple truth is that there is no indisputable evidence to be found in either of their works for an invasion of Ireland. Instead, if we wish to continue to examine the evidence for our hypothetical invasion, we have to put these literary works aside, and turn instead to archaeology.
If our hypothesized invasion did take place, then it would be reasonable to assume that little in the way of archaeological evidence for it would have survived to the present day. As noted by Dr. David Freeman, for a long time it was similarly difficult to find any archaeological evidence that could be credibly linked either to the landing sites of Julius Caesar's 2 expeditions or the later Roman invasion under Claudius. Indeed, historically the idea that the Romans had any major archaeological influence at all on Ireland was dismissed by a number of early Irish antiquarians. As we mentioned briefly before, in 1928 the venerable Irish antiquarian R.A.S. McAllister would boldly declare that, quote, "The Romans made no direct impression on the country. A provincial king invited Agricola to invade the country in order to further some interests of his own, and it is possible that Agricola so far accepted as to send a legion on what proved to be a tentative and abortive expedition. Something of the kind seems to be required to explain a reference in Juvenal. But this expedition, if it ever took place, passed away, leaving no sign except perhaps a lost coin or two, and Ireland remained outside the empire." Based on his words then, you might expect that archaeologists wouldn't have found much Roman material of note in Ireland, never mind a potential landing site for an invasion. In the centuries since he uttered those words though, an assortment of Roman material has been found here. For obvious reasons, a large proportion of these have been discovered on Ireland's eastern coast opposite Britain, but a number of scattered finds are known throughout most parts of the island. By a remarkable chance, one item has even been found 150 miles west of its shores, not far from Porcupine Bank. Here in the mid-1930s, a piece of Roman greyware jar was dredged up by a fishing trawler, which according to archaeologist Dr. Mark Hassel has parallels to other ceramics that have been found in southern Gaul. As to how either it, or a ship carrying it, came to be so far west of Ireland shores, we can only speculate. but its presence, along with other Western finds, suggests that seaborne trade was being conducted in this region throughout the Irish Iron Age. Whilst a wider survey of all the Roman material that has been found in Ireland is kinda beyond the scope of this video, what we have is enough to establish that many Irish communities were likely in regular contact with those of neighbouring Britain throughout the entire Roman period. Very generally, these finds include deposits of Roman coins, along with pottery, metalwork, crafting items, toiletries, and jewellery. As noted by Dr. Jacqueline Carhill-Wilson, in the past, there has been something of a tendency to lump this material into either Roman or native Irish categories. In reality though, separating these finds into such cut and dry categories is often difficult, and we should keep in mind that these items often display a degree of hybridization between Irish and Roman styles, the latter of which were often already hybridized with British or Gallic styles. As for their origins, in the past many antiquarians and later archaeologists argue that these items were likely acquired by the native Irish through their service as mercenaries in the Roman army, or as plunder due to Irish raids on neighbouring Roman Britain throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries that were recorded by contemporary chroniclers. In more recent decades, however, it has been argued that there is only limited evidence for this theory, and that while some material could have been acquired in this fashion, much of it may have entered Ireland through a complicated patchwork of formal and informal trade, and in some cases through settlement by people from abroad. And to pull us back to the main theme of this video, there are few better examples of this complicated relationship than the main archaeological site that has been cited as evidence that Rome may have attempted to invade Ireland. This is the previously mentioned site of Drumanagh in County Fingal. And as it's only a few miles north of Dublin, I figured I'd hop on the ferry over from Anglesey and pay it a visit. Oh, and shout out to the guy who recognised us going through customs.
Today, Drumanagh may not look all that exciting on the surface. It's a large grassy coastal promontory fort that juts out some 420 metres into the Irish Sea and encloses an area of some 46 acres. In the early 19th century, the area was enlivened by the construction of one of the Martello Towers, a series of coastal fortifications built to resist a potential invasion by Napoleon. This invasion would never materialise, and in the decades after, it would instead be used to try and restrict smuggling along the coast. Other than that though, most of Drumanagh now resembles the sort of scenic coastal area where it'd be nice to take the dog for a walk, or to hold a picnic on during a summer's day. Yet back in the Iron Age, this promontory would have been ideally placed to act either as a defensible centre for trade with neighbouring Roman Britain, or to theoretically act as a staging post for a wider invasion. And in the last 70 years, a large number of artefacts have emerged from beneath its soil that have helped rewrite our understanding of how Ireland and Rome interacted.
This site was originally discovered back in the 1950s, when farmers ploughing the area found fragments of Roman pottery, fragments that Vittorio Di Martino notes would mysteriously disappear before reaching the National Museum. In the 1970s, further ploughing turned up yet more pottery shards, this time overseen by archaeologists who identified it as Samian ware, a type of valuable pottery produced in nearby Roman Gaul between the 1st century BC and the 3rd century AD.
Despite these discoveries, no large-scale excavations of the site took place at this time, and in the mid-1980s, Drumanagh would unfortunately go pre-internet viral amongst another crowd of what I'm going to diplomatically term archaeology enthusiasts in a way that would only damage our understanding of the site. Fueled by rumours of easily accessible treasure, over the next few years, a group of amateur metal detectorists decided to take matters into their own hands and illegally plundered whatever they could get their greasy little mitts on from the site. In the aftermath, the Irish Office of Public Works would intervene and slap a preservation order on the site, and in 1995 a trove of these stolen artefacts was seized by the National Museum of Ireland from an attempted sale at Sotheby's in London. Whilst these artefacts were reviewed by archaeologists at the time, as material evidence in an ongoing prosecution, these items remained largely out of access from archaeologists until June 2012, when archaeologists from the late Iron Age and Roman Ireland, or LIRI project, would be granted access to it. Their examinations found that this material contained a wide variety of objects, dating from either the late 1st century or the early 2nd century, roughly from a similar time frame to when Agricola's hypothetical invasion would have taken place. In addition to personal items such as finger rings, pendants, and a range of different fibulae or brooches, these artefacts also include fine metalwork, such as pieces of bronze funerary vessels, unfinished horse bits, and rings and mounts that may once have been parts of a sword mount or scabbard. These items also include roughly 40 whole and partial brass, bronze and copper ingots, which Dr. Jacqueline Carhill-Wilson suggests are evidence of manufacturing work being conducted at the site. And scattered in amongst these artefacts are 16 copper Roman coins, covering the years of the reigns of the emperors Vespasian, his son Titus, Trajan and Hadrian, that together roughly overlap the period when agricola would have been active in Britain.
Since the retrieval of these items, the rest of the site's history has thankfully been a lot less dramatic. Whilst the newspaper arguments of 1996 would lead to the site going largely uninvestigated for the next couple of decades, by the early 2010s the site began to see newfound interest by archaeologists. In January 2012, the Lyre project would perform a geophysical survey of selected portions of the site that had previously been identified as of interest by an innovative archaeological technique known as LiDAR. Whilst these surveys have been disrupted somewhat by the modern digging activities of robbers, this work found evidence of several large structures that may represent enclosures, along with a number of circular anomalies that may be the remains of timber roundhouses or ring ditches. Alongside this, a large number of what are likely ancient pits were detected, some of which may have been used as either hearths or ovens.
Since 2018, our understanding of this site has been expanded further by the Fingal County Council-led Digging Drumanagh project. This project has now conducted 5 seasons worth of community excavations on the site that have led to a wealth of extra materials being uncovered. This work has confirmed the presence of prehistoric structures on the site through the discovery of post holes left over from the original wooden buildings, along with a number of pits that were used as hearths, as well as for grain storage and waste disposal. Elsewhere, a working platform constructed from stone slabs has also been unearthed, along with a number of implements indicating that textile production or craft work of some type was being performed there. In addition to this, a number of pins and metal implements such as nails and possible blades have also been uncovered, along with fragments of glass vessels, blue glass beads, and many shards of pottery from throughout the Roman world. Along with the previously mentioned Samian ware, this also included shards of what may be colour-coated ware, a type of pottery produced in the Cambridgeshire region in neighbouring Britain, and the remains of large globular Dresdel 20 amphora. The latter of these would have been produced in southern Spain, and were used to transport large quantities of olive oil throughout the empire. These excavated areas are also generally marked by the presence of large numbers of bone, antler, metal and stone artefacts associated with manufacturing work, such as textile production, metalworking, and possibly even glassworking, along with dense deposits of animal bones that were likely consumed by the site's inhabitants.
Outside of these general remains, there have also been a couple of extraordinary finds. In the 2023 season, a small antler playing die was found, whilst in 2025, bone and stone gaming pieces were also unearthed, giving us an insight into the more casual aspects of its residents' lives. In the 2024 season, what was first thought to be a gnarly apple later turned out to be the charred remains of a fig, the oldest example of this fruit that has ever been found in Ireland. Finally, in June 2025, the most recent round of excavations at Drumanagh revealed a fully intact Roman pot, the first of its kind ever discovered in Ireland.
On the whole then, the materials found at Drumanagh paint a picture of a thriving Iron Age promontory fort. In addition to potentially acting as a local centre for manufacturing and distribution, the amount of Roman material found here indicates it would have at least been a major trading site for neighbouring Roman Britain, and possibly other parts of the empire too. But to return to the overarching question of our video, do any of these findings indicate that this site could have been a staging post for a potential Roman invasion, a la the one planned by Agricola? The best answer that I can give is possibly. Given the extent of Roman material found at the site, it seems to me that at a bare minimum there would have been some sort of Roman presence here. The additional question though is whether this would have comprised of a military force, or if it was instead limited to a smaller presence, such as a number of visiting Roman traders. At the time of this recording, the evidence found at Drumanagh simply doesn't provide us with a clear answer. There are some aspects of the site that do hint at a more substantial Roman involvement. As noted in the various excavation reports from the Digging Drumanagh project, the storage pits and the specific type of grain found at the site indicate that its agricultural practices of its residents were more in line with neighbouring Roman Britain than other Iron Age Irish centres. Other elements, though, are more ambiguous. For example, whilst one of the structures on the site was tentatively identified as a roundhouse, a type of housing that was common throughout the British Iron Age and parts of Roman Britain, these were also common throughout Irish prehistory. If this site were a staging post for a future invasion of Ireland, it would also be reasonable to assume that items with a distinctly martial character would have been unearthed here. We mentioned before that unfinished horse bits and parts of what may have been sword scabbards were recovered in the plundered material taken from the site, and a small number of possible blades were uncovered in more recent excavations. Another potential sign of the site's military importance that we've so far overlooked is the impressive series of earthen fortifications that enclose its inland side. These fortifications consist of a triple set of banks and ditches, along with traces of a fourth bank beyond the outer ditch. When augmented by additional wooden defences, they would have formed a daunting barrier to any force seeking to assault the site. Vittorio De Martino goes so far as to draw a direct comparison between these defences and similar fortifications erected at known Roman military sites in Britain. For example, a Roman fort that has been unearthed in Richborough was also protected by a similar triple set of banks and ditches, and which may have acted as a base for Roman legionaries during the initial invasion of Britain. But despite the presence of these items and the site's vague resemblance to other Roman fortifications, there seems little evidence to definitively tie them to Roman forces. Yes, these weapons, if that's what they are, could have been used by Roman forces here during the initial stages of an invasion, but to me, it seems equally likely that these items could simply have been used by Drumanach's residents to defend the site. And whilst these fortifications do bear some similarity to those of Roman camps, they also resemble those found at a number of other British and Irish promontory forts that predate the coming of Rome. Perhaps the best studied British example of an Iron Age trading fort set on a similar promontory, Hengistbury Head in Dorset, is similarly protected by a double dyke running across its inland side that long predates the Roman invasion. In Ireland itself, we have the example of the inland peninsula fort of Knockdhu in Northern Ireland, which appears to have been occupied between the Late Bronze and the Early Iron Age. This site was also protected by a triple set of banks and ditches, while similar fortifications are also known at the promontory fort of Dungriffin a few miles to the south. On the whole then, whilst it can be said that Drumanagh certainly seems to have been a thriving centre of cultural exchange between Ireland and Roman Britain during the 1st and 2nd centuries, there is currently little definitive evidence that it acted as a staging post for an invasion. This conclusion is complicated by the fact that much of the site still remains unexcavated, and it is possible that future discoveries by the ongoing Digging Drumanagh project will shed a different light on its character. It should also be said that Drumanagh is not a site in isolation, and that there are other sites in the area where Roman material has been found. For example, on nearby Lambay Island, which lies some 4 kilometres off the mainland to the south of Drumanagh, an intriguing mixture of roughly contemporary material has been found that appears to have parallels to items produced both by the Romans and the late Iron Age Latin style. Here in the 1920s, several burials were unearthed that contained large amounts of prestigious items, including a broken iron sword, a bronze shield boss, and 3 bronze scabbard mounts, along with several Roman and Romano-British style fibulae, a mirror, finger rings, a bracelet, and a torque. Interestingly, 2 of the bodies found in these burials may have been placed in a crouched position, reminiscent of pre-Roman burials in Britain, which, if true, would further suggest that its residents practiced a degree of syncretism between the 2 cultures. Outside of these, a copper coin that was issued either by the Emperor Trajan or Hadrian was also found on the site that matches those illegally scavenged from Drumanagh. Finally, this island is also marked by 2 promontory forts of its own, and these, combined with the materials that have been discovered here so far, indicate that the island may have played a similar role to Drumanagh in the trade networks of the region.
It's in this area that we can also find another brief connection to a figure we discussed earlier in this video, the returning Irish king Tuathail Tecmach. As noted by Richard Warner, some versions of Tuathail's tale dating from the late medieval period, most notably the Book of Leinster version of the Leivor Gavala Éireann, have him arriving in Ireland at a place known as Inber Domnan. Today this place is often identified here with Malahide Bay in County Fingal, which is literally just down the road from Drumanagh. This close proximity is certainly intriguing, and adds to our list of parallels between Tuathail's activities in both Irish mythology and Tacitus' account of Agricola's activities in neighbouring Britain. But as intriguing as this parallel is, we still don't have any archaeological evidence that directly links this area or Drumanagh to a returning Irish king. It could just be that Malahide Bay was widely known by the 11th century compilers of the tale as the most convenient way to reach Tara by someone sailing west from Britain. Indeed, it has been argued by Dr. Conor Newman of the University of Galway that the series of low hills between Drumanagh and Tara forms something of a defined routeway, marked by a series of ritual enclosures and burial mounds. And if you permit me to speculate for a moment, then perhaps the knowledge of this route may have also played a role in the development of the tale, especially given Tara's continuing importance in the medieval period. So at this point, we can say that we still don't have any conclusive evidence that a Roman invasion force landed at Drumanagh, or anywhere in the surrounding area. But what if we broaden out the scope of our investigation beyond this single hypothetical expedition? Is there evidence to be found elsewhere in Ireland of either the Romans or at least non-Irish communities dating from a time when Rome ruled neighbouring Britain? Well, outside of Drumanagh, there are also a small number of inland occupation sites that show what may be evidence of either Roman occupation or Roman-inspired practices. One of the most significant of these sites has been found to the north, near the modern village of Clogher in County Tyrone. Here in the 1970s, Richard Warner excavated an unusual sub-rectangular hill fort that is without known parallel throughout Ireland. Built over the remains of an earlier stone fort and enclosing a roughly contemporary ring barrow, this fort consisted of a single ditch and bank that encloses some 4 hectares. In addition to the fort's unusual shape, which Warner argues more closely resembles sites in Roman Britain, excavations from within its severely disturbed centre have found evidence of a small number of Romano-British artefacts. These include a type of nail cleaner that's also been found in Gloucestershire, Wiltshire and Oxfordshire, along with shards of pottery that Warner argues have parallels to vessels produced in southern Britain in the late 1st century AD. Most intriguingly, this site also includes a fragment of a gilded fibulae that matches the type found at Lambay, and that Warner asserts has a military connotation. A number of artefacts dating from late 4th century Roman Britain have also been found within a later enclosure built within the boundaries of the Iron Age structure, and the absence of Iron Age Irish artefacts at this site has led Warner to interpret its various occupants as groups of invaders from neighbouring Britain, which he theorises may also have included expatriate Irishmen. Others such as J.P. Mallory and John Waddell have been less committal to this idea, though they do both concede that this material indicates a close contact with Roman Britain, and in Mallory's case that small, non-Irish populations may have been active in parts of Ireland. Between Clogher and Drumanagh then, we can say that there were likely small communities living in Ireland around the end of the 1st century AD that had their origins in neighbouring Roman Britain, or at the bare minimum had extensively adopted Romano-British customs. Interestingly, this is yet another site that has been linked to the figure of Tuathail Techtmar, again by the way of the Four Masters of Ireland. As noted by Warner in his 1995 article, the entry for the year 111 AD mentions that after Tuathail's death, Banya, mother of his son and successor Phailemy, erected the Rath Mór of Moglaevnar in Ulster, which is generally held to be the hill fort at Clogher. Throughout this video, I haven't been particularly convinced by Warner's attempts to link various sites where Roman materials have been found with the figure of Tuathail. As interesting as these various associations are, the fact remains that we simply don't have any direct archaeological evidence that such a person ever existed. To conclude our discussion of this figure though, I will say that I am open to his argument that the association of Tuathail with this site, along with some of the other places we've discussed today, may constitute an example of pseudo or proto-history, rather than pure mythology. This is just speculation on my part, but it does seem reasonable to me that if a group of non-Irish peoples had settled in this area, as seems likely from the archaeological evidence, then this event would be remembered in some fashion in the local folklore. It also seems reasonable to me that this folklore would have become linked with that of another famous pseudo-historical figure who was known to have invaded Ireland, or that such an association could later have been made by scholars attempting to incorporate these various accounts into a unified timeline. So after examining these sites, if you held a gladius to my throat and forced me to say whether I think the Romans invaded Ireland, how would I answer? Well, I'd be hard-pressed to say that there is any conclusive evidence for the sort of large-scale invasion Agricola wished to lead. Whilst the literary evidence is tantalising, as are the parallels to the figure of Tuathail Techtmar, the evidence from Drumanagh seems too ambiguous for us to conclude that it represented a staging post for a Roman invasion. Instead, it seems equally likely to have been a trading settlement established by Romano-British immigrants, or even simply a native trading settlement that adopted a number of Romano-British cultural traits. The complete absence of non-Roman materials at Clogher does seem to indicate to me that the Romans, or at least people from Roman Britain, were residents there at different times, but the site simply seems too isolated to represent a major Roman invasion of the area. Even then though, I would hesitate to definitively rule out the idea. The complicating factor though is that at present, the evidence is still in something of a state of flux. As we discussed before, there are still large areas of Drumanagh and other promontory forts throughout Ireland that remain unexcavated, and further investigations there may yet change our understanding of how these peoples interacted. For example, there is a large promontory fort known as Dunabrassin in County Waterford that has been highlighted by Dr. Jacqueline Carhill-Wilson as a potential area for investigation, and whose name tantalisingly means the Fort of the Britons. As such, I think we should keep open to the possibility that the answer to this question may change in future decades, or at the very least continue to grow more nuanced. If we put aside the idea of a large-scale invasion then, what seems more clear from the available evidence is that the Romans, or at least people originating from within the Roman Empire, were present on a smaller scale in parts of Iron Age Ireland. In some places, there is even evidence that these people may have influenced the Irish culture of the time in the form of local religious practices. Because outside of the residential centres we've discussed so far, Romano-British and Romano-Gallic style objects have also been found at some of Ireland's most famous ritual sites. For example, at the Great Neolithic Passage tomb of Newgrange in the Drumanagh complex in County Meath, several Roman coins minted under the late 1st century AD Emperor Domitian and a number of 4th and early 5th century emperors were found in what were likely ritual deposits, along with pieces of jewellery such as rings, necklaces and brooches. Conversely, at the neighbouring passage tomb of Knowth, a set of more domestic items have been found, including more Samian ware, pieces of Roman glass, a long-handled spoon and a stylus. Similarly, a Roman padlock and coin have been found at the ritual centre of Ishnock in County Westmeath, though in both cases the context from which these relics were found is poorly documented. And finally, there is also another major Irish ritual centre dating from the time that the Romans were active in Britain, where a remarkable assemblage of Roman material has been uncovered. This is the previously mentioned Hill of Tara, a major Iron Age ritual centre famous in later medieval history for being the ceremonial seat of the High Kings of Ireland. And as Drumanagh is itself only a half-an-hour drive away, I thought I'd hop on over there myself and check out where they were unearthed.
These finds were found beneath the monument behind me, the Rath of the Synods, a structure that was first constructed in either the Late Bronze Age or the Early Iron Age, that went through a number of incarnations throughout its long history. Today its remains are extremely mutilated, partially due to the construction of a churchyard over its eastern side, but mostly due to the actions of the British Israelites. Between 1899 and 1902, this group got the idea in their heads that the Ark of the Covenant lay buried beneath it, and proceeded to rip apart most of the monument trying to find it. Don't ask why, it's a phenomenally stupid story, and I could make an entire video on it alone. During the time that the Romans were in Britain, however, the site consisted of what has been most commonly interpreted as an impressive three-banked ring fort that may have had a ritual, domestic, or combined function, to which a fourth bank would then be added in succeeding centuries. In the 1950s, excavations performed by a team led by Sean O'Riordan unearthed deposits of prestigious Roman Samian ware drinking vessels within this structure, along with a lead seal, glass beads, pieces of imported glass vessels, and the remains of what may be Roman-style jewellery that resemble those found at Newgrange and Knowth. Alongside this, a cache of 3rd century Roman coins was also unearthed that appears to have been deliberately deposited on the site, a practice that was common during parts of the local Iron Age and in neighbouring Britain. Large amounts of cattle, pig, horse and dog bones have also been found beneath this monument, and they may be the result of either ritual deposits, organised feasting, or a combination of both. Whilst this exact combination of materials is without exact parallel either at other Irish or Romano-British ritual centres from the period, the large volume of Roman material on the sites indicates some connection with neighbouring Britain during this time. As for what that connection may be, there are a number of theories. Perhaps these items were brought to the site by a number of Roman travellers or traders who influenced the ceremonies conducted here. Perhaps they were the sign of an intrusive elite from neighbouring Britain who brought their own ceremonial practices with them. Alternatively, they could have been adopted independently by the area's Irish elites, who could have acquired these prestigious items via trade, and who may have adapted them into existing Iron Age religious or domestic practices. Exactly which of these possibilities is true, we sadly will probably never know. but it provides us with another intriguing glance at the possible cultural interactions between local Irish elites and the wider Roman world. To draw this video to something of a conclusion, it's clear that whilst we have come up somewhat empty-handed answering the main question of whether the Romans were active in Ireland or not, we can handily demolish R.A.S. McAllister's statement that the Romans made no impression on the country. A century on, we now know that even if there was no organised attempt to do a Roman Ireland, there is plentiful, if scattered, evidence of both Roman artefacts and what may be Roman-inspired cultural practices at many Iron Age Irish sites. Perhaps these were spread by a small number of Romans or Romano-British travellers, some of whom even settled in Ireland. Or maybe they were merely the products of long-range trading networks of a type that had been operating along the Atlantic coast since at least the Stone Age. Either way, these items and practices would have given Ireland's residents a glimpse into activities stretching far from their own shores. And alongside everything we've covered today, there's also a few of the small ways in which the Romans did help shape Irish culture. For example, there are a few words in the earliest recorded forms of the Irish language that might have been picked up from the Romans during this time. Useful words like gold, wine, and vessels in which to put the wine. You only need to add words for dice and eunuchs, and you've already got yourself the makings of an orgy. Yes, I know orgies were a Greek thing, not a Roman one. Leave me alone. The earliest Irish script, Ome, was also most likely created using an understanding of the Latin alphabet, and in the medieval period, many other Latin words would make their way into the Irish language too. More specifically, the period when the Romans ruled much of Britain is simply yet another part of the millennia-long thread of cultural interchange between Ireland and its nearest neighbour. This relationship continued long after the departure of Roman forces from these shores, and I'm sure that in the centuries afterwards, everything worked out harmoniously, and that no one in Britain contemplated doing anything awful like invading Ireland ever again. Thank you for watching.